Are you sure you can serve people like us without contaminating the food? The question sliced through the air in the opulent Grand View Country Club with chilling precision. Jonathan Sterling, a man who had everything, the wealth, the power, the status, looked down on Kesha Williams, the new waitress at the club. His sharp $3,000 suit, custom-tailored to perfection, and his expensive Swiss watch glinted under the soft chandelier light as he scanned her from head to toe. In stark contrast, Kesha's simple, modest uniform clung to her like a reminder of everything she wasn't supposed to be in this world. At 52, Jonathan had long since claimed his place at the top of the social ladder. His voice was confident, even smug, as he addressed Kesha. To him, she was just another cog in the wheel of a system designed to keep people like her in their place, and he made sure she knew it. Are you sure you can serve people like us without contaminating the food? His words were filled with contempt, as if she were nothing more than a servant meant to stay out of sight, quiet and invisible. But what Jonathan didn't see, and what the rest of the room couldn't understand, was that Kesha was a force to be reckoned with. She didn't belong here by accident. Her life had prepared her for moments like this. Her dark eyes locked onto his with an intensity that betrayed no fear, no hesitation. It was a look that said, "You may have power, but you will never have control over me." Kesha stood still, taking a deep breath. Her first day at the Grand View Country Club was supposed to be her big break. She knew it wasn't going to be easy, but she never imagined the humiliation would come so quickly and so directly. But one thing was certain. Kesha had never been one to back down. She'd been through too much in her life to let anyone, especially a man like Jonathan Sterling, make her feel small. "I'm sorry, sir, but I didn't understand your question," Kesha replied, her voice calm, but with a subtle power behind it. She looked him straight in the eye, refusing to flinch. The surrounding conversations in the room dropped to a stunned silence. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire club had turned their attention to this confrontation, and Kesha knew it wasn't just about a simple question. It was about something much bigger. Jonathan Sterling laughed loudly, a harsh sound that filled the room like an echo of his superiority. The laughter wasn't just a reaction to Kesha's answer, it was an attempt to reassert his dominance, to remind everyone in the room that he was in control. "Of course, you didn't understand. People like you rarely understand subtleties." He turned to his companions, clearly amused by his own cruelty. "Gentlemen, look at this. Another one for the diversity program. I bet she doesn't even know the difference between a Bordeaux and a Burgundy." His words were drenched in mockery, his tone dripping with privilege and scorn. But Kesha didn't flinch. She didn't cower. She held her ground, her expression unwavering. While the other members nervously chuckled along, she was preparing her next move. Her words were not just a defense but a strategy. In that moment, Kesha wasn't just standing at his table. She was standing up for something far greater than herself. She was about to show Jonathan Sterling and everyone else in the room that there was more to a person than what their clothes, their wealth, or their status might suggest. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jonathan Sterling, his face flushed with rage, leaned back in his chair, convinced that he had the upper hand. The room was still. Every eye was on Kesha, every breath held as they awaited her response. Sterling's words had been an attempt to humiliate her, to show everyone around him that those of his social stature had the power to crush anyone beneath them. And for a moment it seemed as if he had succeeded. But Kesha was no stranger to battles of this magnitude. She wasn't someone who crumbled under pressure. She had faced far worse storms in her life, and they had only strengthened her resolve. Without hesitation, Kesha smiled, an almost imperceptible smile, but one that spoke volumes. Her dark eyes, which had never wavered, now held a calm fire, a fierce determination that no one in the room could ignore. Jonathan had made a grave mistake. He thought he was dealing with a servant, someone meant to endure humiliation without question. But what he didn't know was that Kesha was a strategist. She had studied everyone in this room, every member of the club, and every weakness they tried so desperately to keep hidden behind their golden facades. "Mr. Sterling," Kesha said, her voice carrying through the room with the kind of precision that made him pause. She addressed him by name for a reason, to remind him that he was no more important than she was. "May I suggest the 1982 Chateau Margaux? It perfectly matches the aged arrogance you're serving tonight." The words landed like a bombshell. The room fell into an eerie silence, a collective gasp escaping the lips of those who had been watching with bated breath. Jonathan's face twisted in disbelief. He had expected fear, submission, or at worst, a meek apology. Instead, he had been met with an insult so sharp that it left him speechless. For a moment, he was vulnerable, and that was something he wasn't used to. The men dining with him, who had laughed nervously at his earlier taunts, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Kesha wasn't just another lowly waitress. She was a woman of composure and intellect, someone who could hold her ground even in the face of a billionaire's fury. But Jonathan, unwilling to let go of his ego, quickly regained his composure and scoffed. "How dare you?" he muttered, trying to hide his discomfort behind anger. But Kesha, unshaken, wasn't done. "Or," she continued, effortlessly cutting through his outburst, "if you prefer something more accessible to your palate, we have an excellent Kendall Jackson. Nothing too sophisticated, but perfect for someone who confuses money with class." The challenge was unmistakable. Kesha's words weren't just about wine. They were about class, about privilege, about everything that Jonathan Sterling stood for. She had turned his insult into a weapon and aimed it directly at his inflated sense of superiority. For the first time, something shifted in the room. Sterling, who had always held power over everyone he encountered, now found himself on the defensive. The air crackled with tension, and a subtle shift took place. It was no longer just a simple dinner in a country club. It had turned into a battle for respect. Jonathan was the one being publicly humiliated, and he knew it. His reputation was at risk. And yet, Kesha stood tall, her voice calm and composed, her posture unwavering. As she delivered her cutting remarks, a flicker of realization passed through the eyes of the older waiters, white, subservient, and accustomed to bowing their heads in the face of Jonathan's insults. They began to move toward her, not in support, but in sheer morbid curiosity. They could sense it. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was the beginning of something monumental. Jonathan, still seething with anger, stood up, clearly losing control. But Kesha, without missing a beat, maintained that serene smile, as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. And in a way she had. Her every word, her every move was deliberate. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she knew exactly how this was going to unfold. Jonathan Sterling's arrogance had just signed the first document of his destruction, and Kesha Williams was going to make sure he paid the price for underestimating her. The silence in the room deepened, the tension almost unbearable as Jonathan Sterling seethed with anger. His face was a mask of fury, his hands clenched tightly as he tried to regain his composure. His world, once so carefully constructed, was beginning to crack, and he wasn't sure how to stop it. For the first time, he felt vulnerable, something he had never allowed himself to experience. How dare this woman, this waitress, challenge him? He had built an empire, dominated this town, and held sway over everyone who crossed his path. She was just a lowly employee, someone meant to serve him, not confront him. As he opened his mouth to unleash another round of threats, Kesha did something unexpected. She didn't back down. In fact, she leaned forward slightly, her calm gaze never leaving his, and her voice took on a new edge, one that was firm, resolute, and chillingly clear. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room like a sharp blade. "You're right about one thing. You've built a lot in this town." Jonathan smirked, thinking she was finally starting to bend to his will, but Kesha wasn't done. "But," she continued, her words deliberate and slow, Are you sure you built it all within the law? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Jonathan's smile faltered, and for the briefest moment, his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. His arrogance, the very thing that had once made him untouchable, was now beginning to crumble under the weight of Kesha's words. The room seemed to freeze. Even the older waiters, who had been standing off to the side, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of pity and curiosity, now found themselves rooted to the spot. The sharp edge of Kesha's accusation had hit its mark. This wasn't just a defiant waitress. This was someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The unsettling calm in her eyes, the way she held herself, she wasn't just challenging Jonathan's power, she was exposing it. Jonathan's face turned pale. He had been able to intimidate anyone he wanted, but now, for the first time in his life, he felt exposed. Kesha had asked the one question he could never answer. His empire, built on money, manipulation, and privilege, was no longer so secure. And he knew it. "What are you talking about?" Jonathan demanded, his voice losing its usual conviction. The power he'd once wielded so effortlessly had evaporated in an instant. Kesha, however, didn't even flinch. She simply smiled, the kind of smile that told Jonathan she knew more than she was letting on. "Oh, just general observations, sir," she replied smoothly, adjusting her tray as if the conversation were just another casual exchange. In a small town like this, people tend to talk a lot. And I listen. The effect was immediate. The room shifted uncomfortably as those around her realized what was happening. Kesha wasn't just some waitress trying to make it through her shift. She wasn't a victim of Jonathan's condescension. No, she was playing a much bigger game, and she had just delivered the first blow in what would be a battle to remember. The older waiters, who had once stood quietly by, now began to move closer to her, not to support her, but out of pure curiosity. They had seen plenty of power struggles in this room, but this one was different. This was no longer just about a rude customer and a defiant employee. This was about something much bigger, something that Jonathan Sterling was far too blind to see. But Kesha saw it. She had seen it all along. The way Jonathan had treated her as less than human, the way he wielded his privilege with no regard for anyone else, the way the club had turned a blind eye to the injustices hidden behind its walls. She had studied him, studied everyone in that room, and now she was using that knowledge to expose the very flaws that had kept men like Jonathan in power for so long. As the moment of silence stretched on, Jonathan could feel the weight of the room's collective gaze. His dinner companions exchanged nervous glances, uncomfortable with the shift that had just taken place. For the first time, Jonathan was not the one in control, and Kesha was not about to let him regain it. His pride, his arrogance, had led him to underestimate her. Now, she had forced him into a corner. And in that corner, the truth would be revealed, a truth that Jonathan never saw coming. The room was electric with anticipation, and you could feel the collective breath being held by everyone in the Grand View Country Club. Jonathan Sterling's world had just begun to crumble, and he had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went. The crowd watched, wide-eyed and speechless, as Kesha Williams, once merely a waitress, had now transformed into a formidable adversary. Sterling, the man who had dominated the social and business scene for decades, was visibly sweating, his once unshakable confidence beginning to dissolve into panic. Kesha had just dropped a bombshell on him, and he couldn't recover. The subtlety of her accusation, the quiet firmness in her voice, had torn away the armor of superiority he'd worn for so long. But what happened next would change everything. "I'm afraid you've made a mistake, Mr. Sterling," Kesha said, her voice calm yet powerful, resonating across the room. She wasn't just speaking to him anymore. She was speaking to everyone who had ever been under the illusion that wealth and status could shield them from the consequences of their actions. With a controlled smile, Kesha continued, "You're right about one thing. You've built a lot in this town. But the question remains, how did you build it?" The room was still. There wasn't a whisper, a cough, nothing. It was as if everyone was waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. Jonathan, who had once commanded entire rooms with his mere presence, was now visibly sweating. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. Kesha, unfazed by his discomfort, leaned in slightly, her tone deliberate. "Are you sure you built it all legally, Jonathan?" The room was frozen in time. Kesha's words hit like a gut punch, leaving Jonathan gasping for air. His face turned a ghostly pale, as though the weight of her accusation had knocked the wind out of him. The once imposing figure of Jonathan Sterling, the titan of industry, now stood exposed, a man whose wealth and power had been built on shady foundations, now trembling in front of a simple waitress. The irony was palpable. Kesha's eyes remained unwavering, locked onto him, as the silence in the room grew unbearable. Everyone around her, once intrigued by the drama, now knew that something monumental was happening. This was no longer just a scuffle over pride. This was a moment of reckoning. "What are you talking about?" Jonathan asked, trying desperately to regain control, but his voice lacked the conviction it once held. There was fear in it now, fear that Kesha had uncovered something much darker than he had ever imagined. Without missing a beat, Kesha smiled softly. "Oh, just a little observation, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice dripping with subtle sarcasm. "In a small town like this, people tend to talk a lot. And I listen. I listen very carefully." As she spoke, Kesha adjusted her tray, every word she uttered sending ripples of unease through the room. Her words weren't just an accusation, they were a warning. A warning to Jonathan that everything he thought he could get away with was about to be exposed. And what Jonathan didn't realize was that Kesha wasn't just playing with words. She was playing with the power of knowledge, the power of truth. And those were forces that even the wealthiest man in the room could never escape. The room shifted again. The once comfortable silence had been shattered by Kesha's quiet confidence, her steady presence. The older waiters, who had long been subjugated to Jonathan's whims, began to inch closer, not to offer support, but to witness history unfolding before their eyes. This wasn't just about Kesha standing up to Jonathan, this was about the beginning of his downfall. And for those who had silently endured his tyranny, it was a moment of catharsis. Kesha's next move was nothing short of brilliant. She wasn't just challenging Jonathan on his arrogance. She was bringing something much bigger to light, a network of corruption, a web of deceit. "You know, Mr. Sterling," Kesha continued, letting the silence hang before she delivered her final blow, "what you built on lies. Your empire, your entire business, is built on the backs of people you've used and abused. Your wealth wasn't earned. It was inherited. You just signed checks with the money you took from others. You never had to work for it." Jonathan's face twisted, and for the first time in years, he looked small. His sense of entitlement had been shattered, and the more Kesha spoke, the more that sense of invincibility melted away. His dinner companions, who had once nervously laughed at his jabs, now shrank in their seats, unsure of what to say or do. And then, just when Jonathan thought he had heard it all, Kesha delivered the final blow. "By the way," she added casually, "I've heard whispers in town about your business dealings, about the way you've manipulated contracts, secured deals under the table, and used your wealth to suppress the competition. I've heard a lot, and I think it's time someone looked into it." Jonathan's eyes widened. He hadn't anticipated this. No one had. What Kesha had just suggested was not just an idle threat. It was the beginning of his exposure. His downfall. He had no idea how she knew, but he could feel it in his bones. His arrogance had just sealed his fate. In that moment, Kesha wasn't just a waitress. She was a force, one that had been underestimated for far too long. She wasn't just challenging Jonathan's power. She was about to dismantle everything he thought he could control. And when it was all over, the world would look at him for what he truly was. A man who had fallen from grace, undone by his own arrogance. The air in the Grand View Country Club had changed. What began as a simple dinner, a display of power and privilege, had now become a stage for a confrontation that no one could have predicted. Jonathan Sterling, once the unchallenged king of this domain, now stood as a defeated man. His empire, his wealth, his carefully cultivated image, all crumbling in front of him. The moment Kesha had spoken those words, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The crowd, which had once been enthralled by Sterling's every word, was now on the edge of their seats, watching a masterful unraveling of arrogance and entitlement. As Kesha stood tall, her serene demeanor unshaken by the chaos she had set in motion, the magnitude of the situation began to sink in. Sterling, his face red with fury and humiliation, had no idea what was coming next. His usual tactics of intimidation and dominance were powerless against the quiet strength that radiated from Kesha. She wasn't just standing up to him, she was dismantling the very system he had built, one calculated word at a time. But Kesha wasn't finished. This wasn't just about a public humiliation, this was about justice. The injustice that had been allowed to fester for so long, hidden behind the walls of wealth and privilege, was about to be exposed for the world to see. And Kesha was the one who would make sure of it. "You may be the richest man in this room, Mr. Sterling," Kesha said, her voice steady and unwavering. "But what good is your wealth if it was built on lies? What good is your status when it crumbles beneath the weight of your own actions?" The words hit harder than anything Jonathan had ever heard. His pride had been shattered, but it was more than that. Kesha's calm, methodical dismantling of his character was far worse than any insult. She wasn't just exposing his wrongdoings, she was stripping away the mask of respectability he had worn for years. The room held its breath as Kesha's final move unfolded. The once invincible Sterling Industries was now on the brink of collapse. Kesha's calculated words had set the stage for a bigger revelation, one that would leave Jonathan with no place to run. And then it came, Kesha's ultimate reveal. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice carrying authority, "I'm not just a waitress. I've been working undercover for the FBI for the past 6 months, investigating money laundering, corruption, and fraud. And you, Mr. Sterling, are at the center of it all." The effect was immediate. The room erupted in shocked murmurs as Kesha calmly revealed her official identity. The FBI? The waiters? The guests? No one saw this coming. Jonathan's face drained of color as he finally understood the full scope of what had just occurred. His empire, built on manipulation and deceit, was about to come crashing down, and Kesha was the one who had orchestrated it all. Operation Vintage Corruption, Kesha continued, her voice steady, has been monitoring your illicit transactions for months. Your involvement in money laundering, fraudulent contracts, and illegal business dealings is now a matter of public record. And tonight, your actions have caught up with you. The power shifted irreversibly. Jonathan, once the one who dictated the terms, was now powerless, trapped by his own misdeeds. The silence in the room was deafening as the weight of Kesha's words sank in. She wasn't just a waitress serving drinks anymore, she was the instrument of justice, the one who had brought down the man who thought he was untouchable. As Jonathan attempted to protest, his voice shaking with fear, Kesha raised a hand, her calm composure never faltering. "You're under arrest, Mr. Sterling," she said firmly. "For money laundering, fraud, and corruption against the federal government." The tension in the room was palpable as 2 FBI agents, disguised as waiters throughout the event, stepped forward to arrest Jonathan. The man who had once terrorized his workers with threats now stood helpless as his empire crumbled before his eyes. As Jonathan was led away in handcuffs, his smug smile replaced by fear and defeat, the members of the Grand View Country Club watched in stunned silence. Some felt a deep sense of justice, while others reevaluated their own actions in the wake of Kesha's bravery. The woman they had once dismissed as just a waitress had proven that no amount of money or status could protect someone who had wronged others. Kesha's courage had not only brought down a corrupt man, it had changed the course of everything. But this wasn't just the end for Jonathan Sterling, it was the beginning of something much bigger. Kesha's victory wasn't just personal. It was a victory for justice, for truth, for those who had been oppressed by the very system Jonathan had helped maintain. She had shown the world that no matter how deep the corruption runs, truth and integrity will always find a way to shine through. As the dust settled and the reality of the situation hit, Kesha Williams was no longer just a waitress. She was a hero, and her story would inspire a generation to stand up against injustice, to fight back against the systems that had oppressed them, and to never, ever underestimate the power of one individual who refuses to stay silent. The night Jonathan Sterling's empire fell was the night Kesha's legacy was born, and she had just begun to write it. As the dust settles and Jonathan Sterling is led away, it becomes clear that this wasn't just about one man's downfall. It's about a powerful reminder that no matter how high we climb, no matter how much power we hold, the truth has a way of catching up with us. Kesha Williams, once a mere waitress, became the spark that ignited a revolution in a world built on privilege and arrogance. She showed us that courage is not always loud. It's in the quiet moments when we stand up, when we refuse to let injustice go unnoticed, when we dare to be the change we want to see. If Kesha's story inspired you, if you believe in the power of standing up for what's right, no matter the odds, then hit that subscribe button.